Welcome to another edition of the Chain Mountain Podcast. I'm your host, Hank Ackerman. And today we're speaking with Heather Messer, who is a VP of Operations at Wilbur-Ellis. Wilbur-Ellis is one of the leading global agribusiness companies, and they provide crop protection products, seed, and nutritional solutions to the agribusiness. Heather, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. I'm really excited about this discussion. The food industry is one of great interest and great importance, I think, to not just where we are now, but in our future. Just to cite a statistic here, the US has only about 2% of its population kind of working in agriculture. And yet we produce 25% of the world's corn, 34% of its soybeans, and we're the world's largest agricultural exporter. I think that's a stunning stat because it shows the efficiency of this industry, particularly in the US. Obviously, this is a reflection of the geography that the US has inherited. But in your opinion, kind of what's behind that statistic and then what part does Wilbur-Ellis play in this part of the economy?
Sure. So since World War II, agricultural output has almost tripled. So we
Wow.
have a lot of different ways where we are doing more with every acre of land that we're giving. So you're right, we have a great U.S. geography that's excellent for growing many things. Obviously, corn and soy, the big ones among them. But Wilbur-Ellis, as a family-owned agriculture inputs company, we are helping with that technology in seed technology, in machinery technology, in your inputs technology from insecticides to fertilizer and everything else it takes to grow that crop. So it's our job to partner with the farmer, make sure we're putting the right things on that acre that get them the most yield that they can get out of it. And that's showing over the last several decades, and that the U.S. farmer is producing more food on every acre of land that they have by 3 times since about 1950.
Yeah, that's really incredible. So maybe tell the listeners a little bit about, your role and what your biggest kind of responsibilities are. Like how do you impact the ability to bring that kind of efficiency to the market?
Sure, absolutely. So my specific role is the Vice President of U.S. Operations for our ag retail business line at Wilbur-Ellis. Um, but my biggest responsibility in my role is what we call our freedom to operate functions. So across the U.S., that means that we make sure that there's a safety culture in each one of our stores that gets people home safely. We make sure we're following DOT regulations. We make sure we're compliant with environmental agencies, all of those things. So by and large, that's my biggest job, is to make sure our people are safe and make sure we're doing the right thing for the environment, for the roadways, for things like that. But as it relates to this podcast, I'm also responsible for our distribution network. So I mainly concentrate in our hubs on incoming supply replenishment, and then in our hub and spoke network on the middle mile, getting things out to that last mile and ready to deliver to the grower.
Right. So that means obviously, understanding that demand pattern is very important, right? To make sure that you have the
Sure.
right
Yeah.
product in the right place. That's a big part of the puzzle, right? And ag has a specific set of kind of complexities in relation to that. Um, you know, you mentioned in our previous discussions, right? Ag retail is very reactionary, right? Why is it so hard to plan ahead, right? Despite some of the advances in forecasting and data. Maybe just tell us a little bit about what the specific challenges are for your industry.
Sure. So our grower customers have to deal with a lot of different things when it comes from the seed all the way to harvest. Some of those things, weather and unpredictability. So they need the rain, but they need the rain at the right time so that it's not bringing a pest or bringing a rust or fungicide issue. Um, and then, if they get all of that right, then the markets can be volatile. Different things, from whether it's tariffs or where people are buying or what they're
Right.
looking for. It's a global market that they're trying to navigate, and so the markets are going to change where they can sell things and what they can put on the product that they're selling. So between Mother Nature and a global market, they've got a lot of things to navigate to get that crop out of the ground and make a profit on it.
Yeah. So So that brings me to an interesting question, right? A lot of companies would typically say, I forecast or think that, these are the pests we're going to have, and this might be the timing, and so I build a lot of inventory for that, right? That's not something maybe you can easily do, is build all that inventory. And the other component is kind of you have very specific formulations and production constraints that mean that you've got to bring a very specific solution to the market at a very specific time. Can you maybe give a couple examples of that, or kind of give a little detail behind why that is?
Sure. So you're right that it's all outside of our human control, I would say. So whether it's weather or pests or so. I live in central Washington. Now I'm in the middle of row crops like potatoes and corn, irrigated crops where we get to control the irrigation. But out in the Midwest, we're not controlling that. We're hoping for rain. We're trying to make sure the rain happens at the right time.
Right.
Even in the east side of where I live here, we've got the Palouse, which gives you huge amounts of grain. A lot of the wheat that's in your pasta is grown not very far from me. But if the rain happens at the wrong time, then we've got a rust issue. So the
Right.
things that might handle that rust issue, that's a different product that I need to have in my barn than what handles the mites that might come in the onions, than what handles a beetle that might come to the corn. So we don't want necessarily broad ranging pesticides that are going to kill everything anymore. The U.S. consumer is demanding. It only wants us to put on that crop exactly what it needs for us to get it to market safely. And so I've got to at least have it. It might not have to be in my barn, but it has to be available to me. Whatever Mother Nature is going to deal out to us in the matter of a pest, of an insect, of fungus, anything like that. So the supply chain has to be very nimble to make all that work on a wide variety of crops.
Yeah, so usually supply chains, if they need to be nimble in that regard, right, that puts a lot of pressure also on their suppliers, right? And I think that's something you mentioned is not just I've got to have the finished product in the right place at the right time, but I've also got to make sure that I've got the suppliers. Maybe talk a little bit of kind of, the things that you guys have done to improve that agility, right? So it's a great example. I think a supply chain agility is an overused kind of concept. But I think this applies here, right? Because you're saying I've got a more specific product mix, but the specificity of that product mix and the benefit of having that specificity also relies on me on having a very agile supply chain. And so talk to me a little bit about kind of what you guys have done over the last few years to improve that.
Definitely. I would say the biggest thing we've done is not necessarily in the agile side, but it's in planning. I would say about 80% of what can be planned. So when you put a corn crop in the ground or a soy crop in the ground, you know a lot of what needs to happen. You know how much nitrogen it takes to get
Right.
the basic crop in. You know that you're going to need to do at least however many herbicide sprays you're going to need to do before that's done. There are some basics that we can plan for, and the better we plan that 80%, the more reactionary my supply chain can be to the 20%. It's when we get a little bit lazy and assume that the 20% should be the process for all of it. So as the
Yeah.
more I can plan the 80% and then work on partnerships, both with manufacturers as well as with our growers to partner and try and see what's ahead for them, then I've got room in my supply chain to react to the 20%. So I think, in my opinion, the better I plan what I know, then I've got room in equipment and people, in room on the warehouse floor to plan for the 20% and be as agile as I can.
Yeah, that's such a great point because I feel like so many companies that oftentimes I work with, that's great advice for them, but somehow, they're not either planning in the right horizon, or they're not, kind of taking that concept of what can I make ahead? What's that baseline volume that I know that I can make ahead to reserve capacity for the variances, right? For the fluctuations.
Right.
And so
Exactly.
many supply chains now, kind of tend to focus on, well, I'll get the order and then I'll figure out, what my lead time is and how to do it. But I think it's a really interesting point, something we can all be reminded of. That's typically a function of kind of a good sales and operations planning process, or IBP or SIOP, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
Maybe talk to me about kind of how you guys have, if you have put in that SNOP, and kind of what that looks like for you guys, and where does that fall short, right? Where are you having challenges in being able to say, you know what, I don't have enough data or enough quality of data to be as effective as I'd like to be.
Sure. I would say that we definitely have a pretty robust planning process, and I don't know how different this is from other supply chains. The ag supply chain relies a lot on a fall planning season where we are doing early orders and early purchases for a certain percentage of what we know we're going to use next spring and summer. So in the fall, we're planning probably all the way out to June, July as much as we can.
Right.
Because the better our manufacturers can plan, the better we can plan, the better price everybody gets, all the way down to the grower.
Yeah.
So we're trying to plan as much as we can in the fall, and then we're going through monthly cycles of, okay, this is what we put in the barn, and then starting in about January and February, it's a pretty robust monthly view of what's the weather doing to us, what's happening as far as planting goes. So even our best plans in the fall, if we get rain events in the Dakotas that won't even let
Yeah.
those soybeans go in the ground, it doesn't matter how great I planned in October. So
Yeah.
there are still definitely some things that we have to consider and try and then adjust to. But as much as we can, we're planning in October, November, trying to get the bulk of that. Even if it's only half, but hopefully it's going to be more than half. Even if I can plan half of what I'm doing in October and November, and then starting in January, February, it's a monthly cadence of what is
Right.
the weather bringing us? Are there pests that we didn't expect? Are there things coming earlier or later than what we thought, as far as degree days and things warming up on time, and where
Yeah.
that corn plant is in its maturity? So monthly, we're trying to get through those things all the way through harvest, just to make sure we help our growers get a great crop out of the field, and then we're starting it all over again the next fall.
Yeah. So do you guys do a budgeting process as well?
Oh,
I mean,
definitely. Yes.
okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile those two? I'm always fascinated by this, right? And my hot take of the day will be, I believe if you have a really good sales and operations planning process that has a adequate horizon, that a lot of the budgeting process becomes obsolete, or at least is facilitated by being able to say, I'm constantly looking ahead, doing the best with what I have in front of me, versus, trying to arbitrarily hit some number that I invented, last fall, right?
Right.
Um, how do you kind of reconcile those two? And every company, typically does it a little bit different, but
Sure. I would say for the most part, you're right in that if we can plan our sales and operations to the best of our ability, then the budget it just kind of comes. Aside from if there are big shifts. So I think later in the podcast we're going to talk a little bit about the
yeah, yeah,
soybean market. But
yeah,
if
yeah,
if we budget and plan for a certain amount of acres of soybeans to be planted in the Midwest, and we get all the way to March, and whether it's a weather event or the coffers are still full and they're just not going to plant the acres that we think, and we've got to shift from soy to corn, then that's a different amount of fertilizer. It's a different amount of nitrogen. It's different products to put in the barn for sure. And so at the very least, I've got to be nimble in that budget to say, I'm going to at the very least need to move product around. So my freight budget might be out the window for a minute, or it might take a hit early in the season when I'm trying to get things where I didn't expect them to be. But as well, if I'm not going to move as many tons of fertilizer, then I've got to look at what's my overtime budget for those drivers. What's the repair and maintenance budget look like on those trucks, because they shouldn't be on the road as much. So there's got to be some tweaks here and there, and you have to be ready to roll with those. As well, you've got to be able to explain those to your leaders when those aren't coming in quite the way that you thought they would. Um, but you're right. Once we hit the season, we're going to do our best to hit that budget. But boy, we got to get a crop out of the ground too. So
yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think, relatively speaking as well, I feel like the U.S. has a lot of, consistent attributes in terms of the growing season, those types of things. I mean, fairly regular rainfall. I lived in Africa for a long time, and there are some significant drought periods, right, where there are, and not that there's not in the U.S., but they can be extreme and extremely problematic. Um, to that extent, right? How proactive do you think that, this type of industry and agriculture and generally can be, or will it always kind of be a reactionary industry in terms of like now as we get more understanding of kind of our global weather patterns and some of the pests, and we kind of have more severe weather events as we get more into this kind of complexity, how does that impact, what you guys are doing from a supply chain network, from a planning perspective, globally as well as, regionally to adjust for that?
I think we'll just continue to get more and more proactive. I think we will rely less on, I think, I don't want to call it lazy, but we fall back into that um, reactionary mode, if you will.
Right.
But the margins are so thin for the growers as well as for the retailers and manufacturers and suppliers
Yeah.
that we don't have any choice but to get more proactive, or we won't make it. The grower won't make it either. So we're already seeing some of our growers, as we get more generations on the farm, so those large family farms get larger, they are trying to support several families now instead of just one family maybe. They have to plan, and they have to plan as well as they can instead of be reactionary. So right from the start, our growers are getting more technologically advanced, and they're getting more proactive, which helps us be more proactive, and we can go all the way to our suppliers. So I think that the technology is helping them. AI is going to obviously get us there in, hey, when the weather pattern looks like this, the crop needs this. We're only going to
Yeah.
get better and better at that, instead of we had no idea that might was coming this year. I think our
Yeah.
years of those types of statements are coming to a close. I think we have to get much better at it, or we're not going to survive.
Yeah. Are you actively using AI to try to solve that question? Hey, there's typically we see these weather patterns and then this pest associated with that type of thing.
I think we're getting there. I think it's a use for it. I don't know that any of us have that quite figured out yet. It's just something that I can see in the future. I mean,
Right. Right.
obviously a good use case for it. I think we're all trying to figure out where it fits, how much data is in there, and what's correct and what's not correct, as well as specific to the U.S. for us versus what we might want to look at it, what they might do in Europe or what they might do in Brazil. So
Yeah. I actually think that demand planning is probably at least currently, the best use case of AI, right, at the moment, because of, in supply chain specifically. I'll say, I have to caveat that, right? Um, but the concept of being able to say, I can use, historical statistics, machine learning to be able to apply the right heuristics to that, but then also be able to use machine learning to be able to identify highly correlating attributes that may be from an external data set, right? So weather data, pest data, those types of things, and then be able to do that correlation analysis, and then be able to build and tune heuristics that allow you to be able to predict a little bit better. I think on the supply side, it's a little bit more of a difficult kind of application to take at least LLMs and that type of thing and apply it to that side of what clients use. But for the most part, the demand planning, I think, is a great opportunity for us and a great driver of that efficiency. The better, the more I can predict, the more I can turn that 80% of what I think is going to happen to 85 or 90%, right? Um,
absolutely.
so
That's what I was just thinking
yeah,
as well. If we could get my 80% to 90%, that's a complete game changer as far as the entire industry is concerned.
yeah. So we did mention we've talked a lot about obviously about pests, and you gave a little teaser about soybeans. So for the listeners who kind of aren't aware of this, um, one of the tit for tat repercussions of the tariffs is that China has basically said we're not going to buy any soybeans from the U.S. And I can't remember exactly what the statistic is, but it is I think 72% of the U.S. soybean crop um, goes to China. It's an enormous number, whatever it is. And without that as an as an output, or excuse me, as a market, now the U.S. has to figure out what else am I going to do with those soybeans, but also next year's crop, is this going to continue? What will I do? So this is a huge impact on global trade. And then you have China going to places like Argentina and saying, we're going to buy all of your soybeans. And then to
Right.
Brazil, and Brazil now says, well, I need to cut down more forest in order to have more arable land so that I can supply China with all these new soybeans, right? So there's this impact. Maybe talk a little bit about kind of what you have experienced from that impact, and kind of what the repercussions are for the growers, as well as how that challenges your ability to stay agile.
Sure. So the grain bins are full still of 2024 soybeans because we didn't sell those throughout the 2025 year.
Wow.
And we've
Wow.
got a 2025 crop getting harvested or has recently been harvested, maybe with nowhere to go with it. So,
Mm.
of course, the growers are, I don't have a market for my 2025 crop. They're already trying to plan 2026 and figure out what they're going to do. We'll see a big shift to corn. We'll see a big shift to maybe other alternative crops, but they don't have a lot of options. If you're in corn and soy, it's not, you don't get to suddenly
Yeah.
grow almonds, right? So
Yeah.
it's not like out here on the, I would say, west of the Rockies. The specialty group has a little bit more flexibility in what they get to do when markets change. But so what we're going to see is growers really going into survival mode. They've got to try and ride out 2025, and then what are they going to do to get a minimum viable crop into 2026? What are they going to grow? And then they're going to have, without a lot of income from 25, it's going to be
Yeah.
a very minimum crop. So we have to adjust as well. We have to plan on the minimum amount of fertilizer, or just mining the soil and trying to get what they can out of the soil, and putting very little fertilizer in there and trying to get that nutrient that's left in the soil, get that out of there instead of by putting it on the crop. And then as well, as far as pesticides, they're going to use generics. There's not going to be a lot of high quality or high technology pesticides being used. So um, it's probably going to be a lower quality crop, but it's going to be a crop. And then it's going to be the minimum thing that they can put out and still make dollars. So we've got to try and plan for all of that.
So, without putting you on the spot for this, what do you think's going to happen with all of those soybeans that are coming in? Right, your bins are full. You're now going to be harvesting a crop, this fall. Where's that all going to go? Right? Is there do you think that it'll get dumped on the market? What's your prediction?
I honestly don't know. I don't, I have no idea where it can go. I think it's, obviously US soy prices are going to be much lower, but we're not great users. So it's not
Yeah.
going to, that'll take very little. But I know that the American Soybean Association, I mean, we've got people working hard on this, trying to find
Oh,
other
cool.
markets for it aside from China. Can they send it to, I was at the Women in Agriculture conference here a few weeks ago, and so they were talking about other markets. Where else can we send this? What else can it do? So they're working hard to try and find spots and try and replace that export market. But I'm not sure what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think this is one of the really challenging scenarios that's come out of the tariffs, right? And maybe unplanned. So yeah, obviously I've worked a lot of metals and other industries that are impacted, but this was one that really drew my attention just because of the size and the severity of the impact, right? And as you mentioned, the margins aren't huge, right? So we're putting an already, call it delicate industry under a lot of pressure, and these individual growers, not making, lots of money coming out of each season. They got fixed costs to cover, put food on the table, right? So it's a real challenge, right? Um, so, you also mentioned a little bit about, kind of using more of the generics. Talk maybe a little bit about, um, what you're seeing in terms of the U.S. food market, or at least the types of products that are being grown, organic versus, the various, I'll call it, premium, call it crops that we're now pushing out onto the shelves. It's great. I think that the food itself, is getting healthier, and we're recognizing the relationship between the brain and the microbiome and the gut, and how that's impacted by food. But that also adds complexity into our agricultural market, right? So now I have, a multitude of the different, like, levels of quality that I could bring to the market. What is that doing to you in your product portfolio?
I would say there's just a divide in there's a portion of the US consumer and even the world consumer that is focused on sustainability. They're focused on health. They're definitely focused on the highest quality produce that can come out, and they can afford it. And then we've also got on I think the other end of the spectrum, the US food supply is still the cheapest food supply in the world, but it's probably at the cost of sustainability and maybe health. We are putting highly, I would say, just highly processed foods in. That's not as nutrient dense of a calorie as is going. So that cheapest food supply, it might not be the best food supply depending on where you're trying to put your priority. So I think that our growers are trying to figure out where they land in that. If you are putting all generics in, you're doing the very minimum to get that crop out because you're throwing it into a highly processed food chain, probably doesn't matter. If you are selling to somebody that is really looking at the nutrients in that, they aren't wanting to supplement nutrients, they want their nutrients to be in their whole food. They want that whole food to be the most nutrient dense, sustainable thing that it can be, and they are willing to pay for it. That's a completely different crop. Especially in the specialty market, that's a completely different crop than a crop meant for a highly processed, just get calories on the table, low cost food supply. So our growers are having to navigate that as well and try and figure out where they fit in that supply chain, or in that, I guess, value chain.
And to me, it's an incredible kind of period of learning and development that we're going through, right? I think, certainly when I was growing up, obviously food was very different, and maybe my parents didn't really think about, the difference between, Cheerios and mac and cheese and a healthy dinner at night and lima beans and all that kind of stuff, right? We never had the discussion. But I think you're right. Now, the science is getting much more advanced, and we're realizing a calorie isn't just a calorie, right? That there's more to it, right? And a calorie, the old definition ultimately is, you take a piece of food and put it in a Bunsen burner, and it measures basically how much heat it put out, right? And that's technically speaking, how you arrive at a caloric output of a product. That said, now we realize, hey, there's a lot of ingredients in terms of sugars and the types of sugars and how that impacts your brain health and your gut health. Corn, soys, all those things have, a lot of impact. And as we think about now ultra processed foods, you're right, they're cheaper. But no matter your political standing, I think that most people and most parents who now, care about putting their, giving the best inputs to their kid, think a lot about, what am I putting in front of my kid? And are those calories good? And is it ultra processed food, right? And unfortunately, to your point, we don't have as many options maybe as we would like to have in our grocery store to have not ultra processed foods, right? all that said, um, one of the hallmarks of an industry like this is as we're getting that science, can we put that science to use? And so to me, the question becomes, what is preventing you guys from taking your innovations and getting them to market and making those changes? And I kind of shifting to a couple of the constraints in that, but maybe set the stage, if you will, by telling the listeners about your innovation process and kind of what you see as the next. You don't have to give us all the nitty gritty details, but what do you see as the big next steps in terms of the innovations that you guys are trying to bring to market, and how long is that taking, right?
Sure. So as far as Wilbur-Ellis specifically, we are diving headfirst into innovations in the fertilizer world. Specifically this year, we're looking at a new organic fertilizer product that we are very proud of that is 100% plant available nitrogen. So if you're familiar with organics at all, what has been on the market in the past, whether it's compost or whether you're tilling in the organic matter from last year's crop or your cover crop, whatever's happening, you don't know when that nitrogen is going to be available to the plant. It all depends on how fast it breaks down in the soil and then when the plant needs it. But as we talked about with innovation in these plants and innovation in agriculture in general, we know exactly when the plant needs that nitrogen and when it's best for it. Right. We don't always have time to wait for that compost to break down, or the compost isn't breaking down at exactly the right time. So we've got some things that have come to market this year in the organic fertilizer space that gets that nitrogen available to the plant, 100% available. So we put it on when it needs it. Right. And that plant, as an organic plant, is much healthier and stronger than we've seen in the past. So we're pretty excited about innovations like that are coming to make that healthier organic plant more available to more of the world. So the better we get at that manufacturing process, the better we get with that, the value there, then the more those plants and those products are available more widespread rather than just to the select few that we talked about before that have the dollars to be able to consider that. So we're pretty excited in that space. It's a big breakthrough for us.
What do you think that kind of the yield improvement associated with that could be? I mean, not to say if you guys have done the exact science on that, but like what's a range, if you can give one, of what kind of yield improvement that would be if you could use that specific, kind of fertilizer where, you're giving the nitrogen to the organic plant at that specific time and it's healthier and stronger and able to yield more, right?
Right. My agronomists are going to be very disappointed that I don't know that. I'm sure they've got numbers and I'm sure they've done the studies. There's definitely been a ton of work put into this in whether and a variety of crops, from blueberries to apples to pears to cherries, hops, wine grapes, all the things. So it's happening on a variety of crops, and I'm sure there's studies in each of them as far as what the results are. And they'll give me a hard time after this, Hank, for not knowing any of those numbers. But.
That's okay. We'll put you on the spot there. I apologize for that. So definitely, big improvement. What's keeping you guys from being able to get those innovations quickly to the market, right? I mean, it seems like these are, yes, we should have policies in place and put people on this and let's get to it, right? This is a tough competitive industry, and we're in a, it's a competitive global market right now that food can pretty easily move around the world. In order for the U.S. to stay competitive and keep our advantage, right? You would think that we're doing everything we can to make it easy. Are we?
No, definitely not. So I would say with what I described before in the fertilizer space, it's a different story than when we talk about pesticides and biologicals on the other, I guess, the other side of the coin of what it takes to get a crop to market. So when we look at the different pesticides that it takes to put on a corn crop, on a wheat crop, whatever we're looking at, as well as the biologicals, both in the pest control space as well as enhancing that fertilizer uptake. We're a bit behind in the U.S. on those things. So I would say our EPA backlog is anywhere from 11 to 13 years. So we've got a lot of
Wow.
manufacturers trying to get new technology, better technology, into the pipeline to create a stronger plant and a healthier end product. And we are so backlogged right now that we're falling behind both Europe and Brazil in that. So um, it takes a lot of years and a lot of dollars. And I know that we've talked a lot in this country about making healthier food.
Right.
And pesticides have been a part of that conversation, as
Right.
they should be. We should be looking at all of the ways that we can continue to feed the world and do it in the healthiest way
Absolutely.
possible.
Yeah.
Um, but we've got to get a more streamlined approach in the EPA to get the highest quality and the I guess best technology out there and on the crop. So I would say 11 to 13 years is should be unacceptable. We've got to get the
Yeah.
I don't want to not test. We need to test it as much as possible. We need to have absolute confidence that we are putting the best stuff out there. It's our food.
Yeah.
However, other countries have proven that they can get it done much quicker than we can, and that
Yeah.
backlog is
Yeah.
hurting us in the U.S.
When the and I mean the EPA budget, I think in general is getting slashed. I'm not sure about that particular part of the budget. Do you see that backlog getting bigger or smaller? Kind of in the next few years.
I would say that with this administration's concentration on the health of food, even if the EPA budget gets slashed, I would hope that they are looking at ways to make sure that we can get the best technology through the pipeline faster. So maybe it's just a change in priority.
Right.
And
Right.
I'm the first to say I
Okay.
don't know
Yeah.
everything that's under their purview or what they have to do or what they're tasked to do
Right. It's
throughout
a
the
lot of
entire
things.
U.S. So
Yeah. This is one of
it's
the
always
smartest.
easy to
Right.
give somebody else a job or think someone else can do their job
Yeah.
faster. So
Yeah.
I think that even with the slash, with this administration's focus on the healthy aspect of food, I would think that we could get that priority shifted at least so that we can get good innovation
Yeah.
out to our growers quicker.
Yeah. We hope. Um, So why is Europe so much faster? What are they doing, in your opinion, that's a little bit different in terms of kind of a different approach to how they think of, the testing and approval process, right? And I'm, jumping ahead. You had mentioned in our previous conversation, Europe is faster to adopt these, chemistries and biologics. What are they doing that's different?
Sure, I would say Europe's biggest. I think it was 2021 or 2022. They had a pretty big push on what they called like maybe farm to table or farm to something similar. So they in the European Union had a strategy that took biologicals and put them on a different pipeline in their approval process
Mm, yeah.
than engineered pesticides.
Okay.
So they're taking the biologicals and they're getting those out in just a different set of tests and trials, knowing
Right.
that there's um, just less active time in a biological. They are a very specific product. It's definitely niche. You maybe have to put together two or three different biological solutions because they're each targeting their own specific pest and they're targeting that in maybe a 10 to 14 day timeline versus the broad spectrum pesticides that we use from the
Right.
50s, 60s, 70s that are
Yeah.
they're sitting out there longer, but they're also doing more things and frankly killing more things, which is
Right.
great, or it was great at the time. It was the best we had at the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Europe has a kind of a fast track for their biological products that are much different than their manufactured pesticides. In the U.S., that's still the same. It's the same track. And so our biologicals are part of what's sitting in that 10, 11 to 13 year pipeline. Our biologicals are sitting there just like our manufactured pesticides are sitting there instead of them being on a faster track, completely different mode of action most of the time. So
Okay, actionable insight for the people from the EPA listening here. I got a, I got
Us out.
a easy one for you guys, right? Figure out the way to fast track certain products, and you don't have to put them all through the same pipeline.
Right.
Brazil is doing it too, right? What can we learn from them?
Yeah, Brazil has some unique things going on too. In that, yes, their biological market's like more than $800 million now. They just jumped in and they're doing a lot of testing. They've got a lot of things in the pipeline, but they also have this on-farm growing of biological strains. So they have just some unique programs going on where they've got their farmers in the midst of the manufacturing and growth of the biologicals. So they're invested. They're all in. This is true farm to table, I guess, from that
Yeah.
perspective. So Brazil's doing some interesting things to make sure that their biologicals stay at the forefront as well.
Yeah, and it's a extremely rapidly growing population, but also industry for them, right? And I know we still get a lot of imports, agricultural imports, from Brazil as well,
Right.
beef and a number of other areas. Um, what do you think kind of needs to change? What other things need to change in the U.S. in order to become for our farming to become more cost competitive, right? And obviously, there's labor challenges, there's some of the pest control components. Um, what else do you think needs to change from either a policy standpoint or efficiency standpoint, right, to get us more cost competitive?
I would say that in the U.S. we've got not only you mentioned 2% of the people are involved in the agriculture industry versus 100% of the people eat.
Yeah,
But so that means that 98% of those folks don't have a very good idea of where their food's coming from and what
right,
it takes. Um, but they're all participating in the conversation. They're all activists to some degree
right,
without
yeah,
quite understanding what it takes to get that. Whether it's the egg from the farm to their egg carton, or whether it's the corn that gets into their tortilla, it doesn't matter.
right,
So I would think that just if we had um, we've got a lot of ag influencers now, and I think it's helping. I think there's people getting closer to their food, or at least wanting to understand where their food is coming from.
right.
But I don't know that we need to continue to get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. I think we need to continue to understand what the value is of that food. So I think
Yeah,
that we've got to start to help people understand that if we're going to start to prioritize health, if we're going to prioritize sustainability, then we have to make sure that we pay for that value. That there's a value to that.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
so I
Yeah,
think that in our quest to continue to get cheaper, more efficient food, I don't know that that's necessarily, um, we've gotten there. We're doing it. We're the
yeah,
best in the world at it.
yeah,
And then, like we talked about, what we're putting on the table isn't necessarily maybe the best food
yeah,
that we can be
yeah.
putting on
We've
the
got an
table.
obesity epidemic, right?
Definitely.
I mean,
Yes.
seventy
Yeah.
percent of the U.S. qualifies as obese, right? So that's a serious challenge, and it puts a lot of pressure specifically on our healthcare. Knowing that so many of these people are going to be challenged with either diabetes type 2 or 1 at some point in the future, or some related health challenge. And if you look at the statistics within kind of our health outcomes, a lot of those health insurance costs and coverage is really around dealing with some of these call it outputs or consequences of our industrial kind of food consumption. Um, so I think we're starting. It feels like we're starting to begin to create that correlation, right? And now I think as hopefully voters can get more educated and be able to push policies that are going to help us, solve some of the, hey, if we want healthcare to get cheaper, it's not just saying, hey, I need to fix healthcare insurance, right? It's I got to go
Right.
to the root of the problem, right? Which ultimately is how do I take care of humans to begin with so that we don't develop some of the problems that are now driving people into the healthcare system and driving a lot of the cost into the healthcare system. So it's a very complex ecosystem. And I would venture to guess that, if you kind of quizzed most Americans on the street, um, they're not educated about the relationships there and the complexity there. So hopefully we can kind of get that word out and like you said, the agriculture influencers can do their thing. Um, Looking ahead kind of 10 years, what do you think agriculture becomes? Is it more resilient or more fragile? Where do you think we're headed?
I think it becomes more resilient, but I think it's at the I would I would call it more resilient through transparency. And so that transparency is going to feel fragile for a while
Right. Yeah.
because like we talked about with people not necessarily understanding where their food comes from, as we get through that um, educational process, we're going to get a lot of opinions, a lot of inputs, a lot of folks. So it's going to feel fragile for a minute, I think,
Yeah. Yeah.
as we get people better understanding, and then as that transparency comes all the way to light, I think it becomes we have to eat. So I think it's got to become stronger,
Yeah.
but it might take us a minute to get there, and it's going to
Yeah.
feel very vulnerable for a minute, and then we're going to build a food chain that is. I think everyone's all in.
Yeah.
They're ready to go. They might know their farmer, and that farmer might be halfway across the world, but they feel like they know them. They trust them. They know what they're putting in. They're
That's
feeding the
right.
same thing to their kids. Um, and there's maybe a trust in the system through the transparency.
So I'll put you a little bit on the spot here. I'm interested to know, over the last, 10 years, right, you've had a lot of access to information about, pests and pesticides and our agricultural supply chain. Um, how are you eating different? You and your family eating different now than you were 10 years ago, right? What have you learned and what could like a listener practically take and say, oh man, I'm eating that stuff. And she said, stop eating it, right? So maybe there's something there, right?
I'm probably not going to be on a stop eating that stuff. I'll tell you, it's all in moderation. But
Right.
I have, as I've grown my position in Wilbur-Ellis, I've had the great fortune of being able to see different agricultural products at the height of their harvestability that didn't have to make their way across the US or across the world before they got to me. So I will
Right.
tell you that you don't have to put almost anything on a potato that came out of the ground that day. It is
Yeah.
so good. You don't
Yeah.
have to put anything on a piece of sweet corn that got picked that day. And so I
Very
wouldn't
good.
necessarily say that you have to stop anything, but the things that are closest to you, eat those at the height of their harvestability. So
Yeah.
the apple off the tree, the potato straight out of the ground. If you can get tomatoes fresh from harvest, strawberries fresh from harvest, all of
Right.
those things, the closer that you can get to them. So get to know your local farmer,
I
go to your
think that's
farmer's market,
yeah. Yeah.
try and find folks that are growing in your area, even if that's not the main crop for your area. If you've got community gardens or things like that. But I would just say get as close to the harvest as you can get, because there's nothing like it. There's nothing like the taste of that food is so different from what you're getting at the supermarket. And if the supermarket's all you've got, then make the best of it and
Right.
and
Right.
get a variety and do all the things that you can. But the closer you can get to the harvest, the better.
That's right. And frozen versus fresh, right? So if you do struggle with getting a truly fresh, portion of the supply chain, I live in kind of a small town that's not in the normal, so a lot of the grocery store produce you can tell doesn't have a long life left,
Sure.
right? Um, Frozen as an alternative, are you proponent?
Absolutely. So the technology these days, it's amazing, right? So if you've got something that's being frozen at the height of its, I said harvestability. I don't even know if
Yeah,
that's a word, Hank, but
I like
that's
it.
what I'm
You
going to say.
owned it.
So
It's
if
yours.
we're harvesting and we're not expecting that piece of produce to continue to mature on the road, right? So we're harvesting it
Yeah,
at the best spot with the most nutrients, flash freezing that and getting that in a bag and off to you. Probably the next best option for sure.
that's really cool. That's great. Well, Heather, this has been an absolute blast. I could talk about this for hours more, um, but we'll have to end it now. And I'd love to check back in on a couple of these topics here in the not too distant future, maybe to see what happened with the soybeans. But
Sure.
it has been wonderful to have you. Thank you so much for coming on, and good luck in getting all these innovations to market. We're really excited to see all of the great stuff that you guys are doing out in the marketplace.
It's been a great talk. Thanks.
Thanks.